Greetings, class. Welcome back to our discussion of the late 19th and early 20th century. This video will focus on neo-imperialism. I just want to make it clear that we are not leaving the progressive era. The previous videos that we discussed, the progressive era, those events are happening at the same time as these discussions on American imperialism. So from the late 1800s through the early 1900s, it's the same time period, right? So the progressive era is more of a focus on domestic policy. This discussion of neo-imperialism is more of a focus on foreign policy. However, this particular video is really going to be more about background, okay? So we're really going to focus on a lot of things in this video that are not really American. It's really more of a sort of a Eurocentric focus, but it's going to provide context for where we are in the next video. All right. So even though there's a lot of information in these slides, we're going to go over them fairly quickly because it's not really American history. It's just providing the background for key events that happen in American history. All right. So you see here this word neo-imperialism, all right? The word neo, or the prefix neo, simply means new, all right? Whenever you see neo, it means new. So neo-imperialism is referring to the age of empires that exists from the late 19th to the early 20th centuries, all right? So this is distinguishing it from, the ancient world age of empires, or sort of the era of exploration and colonialism that happens beginning with Christopher Columbus, with the British Empire, the French Empire, the Spanish Empire, all that we would have talked about in U.S. History Part 1. All right, so we're specifically looking at the late 1800s through the early 1900s. All right, so the nations that are engaged in this period of imperialism, all right, sometimes this can be referred to as neo-colonialism. It's essentially building empires in the world just in a later time period. All right, so the nations who are engaged in that are primarily Western European nations. All right, so we see Britain, France. Now, you see Italy and Germany. Italy and Germany are interesting because those nations don't exist until the late 19th century. Italy and Germany are both created out of a unification process where smaller Italian states and smaller German states join together, right? So Italy and Germany are relatively new nations during this time, but they get involved in imperialism. So Britain, France, Italy, Germany, Austria-Hungary, which is technically one empire, and then Russia. And then you'll see here Japan and the United States. Okay, so we've got primarily 6 European nations, and then Japan and the U.S. All right, all of these are considered Western nations. All right, so primarily when we say Western nations, we're thinking of Western Europe, but Japan might seem to be a little bit of the outlier there. So obviously Japan is not in the West, right? Japan is the land of the rising sun. It's not the West. However, Japan has gone through a process of westernization, or sometimes people will use the word modernization. Sometimes that word can be controversial today, but westernization or modernization, what we mean is Japan has industrialized. Japan has a modern military. And then, of course, the United States is very similar to Europe in terms of industrial and military power. All right, so if you look at that cartoon over there to the left, you see several of these nations that we've just mentioned carving up a pie. That pie is supposed to represent China. So England, Germany, Russia, France, and Japan are over there carving up the pie. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. All right, so what sets this period of neo-imperialism apart from previous eras is basically the places that are being colonized. All right, we're basically talking primarily Southeast Asia. We're talking Africa, especially equatorial Africa, and certain Pacific islands. All right, so why is it that these places are just now being colonized? All right, it has to do with where they are, right? So when we look at a map of the world, all right, the areas that are being colonized in the late 19th century and early 20th century is in the area that would be highlighted in that sort of red or pink stripe there across the middle of the map. That is the tropical zone, all right? So if you'll notice, the tropical zone includes a lot of South America and Central America. It includes most of Africa. It also includes Southeast Asia and a lot of those islands in the Pacific. All right. These areas had previously been unconquerable by Europeans. All right. If you look at the parts of the map that aren't highlighted, those are the temperate zones. All right, those are places where Europeans have colonized. So Australia is colonized by Europeans. South Africa, colonized by Europeans. North Africa could be colonized by Europeans. You know, most of Europe obviously could be, you know, Europe is obviously European, but most of Asia could be colonized by Europeans. For example, Russia went all the way across the continent, sort of like how America did. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. And then, you know, like Chile and Argentina, those places have been colonized by Europeans. All right, but in that tropical belt, Europeans weren't able to colonize those places because basically the biggest limiting factor was disease. And then, of course, you also had indigenous peoples there that resisted colonization. Now, you had indigenous peoples that resisted colonization in the temperate zones as well, but that combined with the tropical diseases basically made it impossible. So what's going to allow Europeans to overcome those obstacles is medical technology and military technology. All right, it's probably the most important piece of medical technology discovered during this time is something called quinine. Quinine is made from the bark of a tree, and it prevents you from getting malaria. All right, so that's going to help them overcome these tropical diseases. Just a little note on here, sort of a fun fact. Quinine is a ingredient of tonic water. All right, if you've ever heard of a drink called a gin and tonic, tonic water has quinine in it. And so the gin and tonic was sort of the drink of imperialism because, you know, how do you get soldiers to take their medicine? Well, you offer them a drink of gin mixed with this tonic. And so obviously the powers that be wanted these soldiers to take the quinine. And so to get them to do that, they gave them some gin. Also, when gin and quinine are mixed together, it actually makes both taste better than they would alone. So that helped. And then you see mosquito nets there. Obviously, mosquito nets don't do you much good when you're walking around, but when you're trying to sleep, they'll keep the mosquitoes away. As far as military technology goes, breech loading rifles. So breech loading rifles can be loaded much more quickly than muzzle loading rifles. So that new technology allowed soldiers in the late 19th century to fire more rounds at the enemy, which would be advantageous fighting against, you know, for example, in equatorial Africa, fighting against natives. And then the Maxim gun, this was really the first, you know, machine gun, which some people have called the greatest tool of British imperialism, the Maxim gun. You see another term down here. It says gunboat diplomacy. So this is key in these Western powers being able to conquer because basically they're going to have better ships, which they will use to attack cities. Big important cities tend to be on either rivers or coastal areas. And so the Western powers are able to use this modern naval technology to force favorable trade terms with these nations. And so we call that gunboat diplomacy. Okay, so very briefly, we're going to talk about the First Opium War. This really sort of predates the age of neo-imperialism, but it's worth mentioning. This was a war between China and Great Britain. One thing to understand during this time period, China is not ruled by Chinese people. China is ruled by Manchurians, and that is why in that previous slide when it showed those European powers carving up China, it showed the guy with the long fingernails with his hands raised. That would be a Manchu, so that would represent the Qing dynasty that rules China. So just be aware, China is not ruled by a Chinese dynasty. It's ruled by a Manchu dynasty called the Qing dynasty. All right, but anyway, this war happens and Britain wins. And the main reason they're able to win is because of their gunboat diplomacy, right? They have better ships. China has a much bigger army, but Britain has a superior navy with modern capabilities. And so, as I mentioned in the last slide, gunboat diplomacy, these countries with the better ships, which happens to be the Western nations, including Japan, they're able to force favorable trade conditions. And so, in this First Opium War, as part of the treaty to end the war, what's called treaty ports are established in China. All right, there's 5 treaty ports. But the point is these treaty ports are going to be open to foreign trade. And so the Western powers really get the advantage in these 5 treaty ports. They also have a condition called extraterritoriality. So if you are a Westerner in one of these treaty ports, you are not subject to Chinese law enforcement officials. You would have to be arrested by officials from your nation. Chinese officials would have no authority over you. You also see here that Hong Kong becomes part of Great Britain after this war. So Hong Kong is a British colony from this point forward. All right, a few years later, we have the Second Opium War. This is between Britain and France against China. So Britain and France are allied here. And basically what we get here is more concessions to the West, right? So Russia, France, Great Britain, the United States, they're all going to get pieces of these Chinese treaty ports where they have special privileges and things like that. All right, the Cochin China campaign, this is in Southeast Asia. This is the beginning of the French conquest of Southeast Asia. So now we're really getting into that tropical zone. You see here the years 1858, 1862. This is going to be an important topic in our class several videos from now, okay? Basically what we're establishing here is French control of Indochina. Indochina is essentially Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. So when we get to the 1960s, 1950s, 1960s, and we start talking about Vietnam a lot, this is important to understand that Europeans, the French specifically, gained control of this area in the 1800s, and it's going to be a French colony called French Indochina. The Third Anglo-Burmese War, really all we're concerned with here, this is sort of the area between India and Southeast Asia, and Britain controls this. All right, so the important thing here to understand is that by the time we get to the end of the 1800s, the only country in Southeast Asia that is not ruled by Europeans is Thailand. Thailand's going to be a monarchy, an independent monarchy. So most of Southeast Asia is going to be ruled by some European power. That's the point we want to make there. All right. Now, same thing goes for Africa. All right. In the late 1800s, we have something called the Scramble for Africa. This is basically, I mentioned that Germany was sort of a new nation being created. In fact, one of the engineers of the unification of Germany, a man named Otto von Bismarck, he heads up the Berlin Conference, which basically he invites all the European powers and says, hey, let's carve up Africa. Who's going to get what? What are the rules? Essentially these European nations, even though some of them are rivals, they're going to work together when it comes to carving up Africa. And so by the end of this scramble for Africa, only 2 African nations are not ruled by Europeans. That's Liberia, which was a colony created by the United States for the purpose of sending freed slaves there if they wanted to go back to Africa. And then Ethiopia. All right, so Liberia and Ethiopia, the only 2 African nations not colonized by European powers by the time we get to the early 1900s. All right, so we haven't talked much about the U.S., all right, but again, we're setting the stage. So all of this has been taking place, all right. In the meantime, the United States has not been involved in this sort of global conquest because the United States has been concerned with the conquest of its own continent, right? So in U.S. History Part 1, we talk a lot about the idea of manifest destiny, the idea that the United States has the right to expand its borders, okay? So you can imagine the United States started as 13 states with land going to the Mississippi. They won that land going to the Mississippi in the American War for Independence. Then we had the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of the United States. And then through war with Mexico, we got all the way to the Pacific Ocean, all the way to California. Then we were concerned with sort of subduing the Indian nations that existed on the Great Plains. And so the United States, for most of its history, all the way up into the late 1800s, has been really fighting a war of imperialism, if you want to call it that, within its own borders, within its own continent, right? But now that's over. By the end of the 1800s, there's nothing left. So now the question is, do we get involved in overseas colonization? Do we, become imperialists like Britain, like France, like Italy and Germany, right? So that's really the question is, does the U.S. need to keep going and keep conquering, other nations that would at this point be overseas? All right, and there's some people who say yes. So we're going to look at those justifications, all right? So the first justification would be a military justification, right? The idea that conquering overseas places would be, it would have strategic benefits, right? It would be a good idea to have a naval base in Hawaii, something like that. All right. So, for example, an important advocate of imperialism from a military viewpoint was Alfred Thayer Mahan. Alfred Thayer Mahan was a naval officer. He was also a military historian at the U.S. Naval War College, but he had done a lot of studies of Great Britain. Great Britain during this time period is the biggest, most powerful nation in the world. And so, he says, how does Britain become such a great and powerful empire? Well, it's because of their Navy. So Mahan is an advocate of building up the Navy, creating a strong, powerful Navy. He's also advocates for a Panama Canal, because you can imagine the United States, we have, technically 3 coasts. We have the Atlantic coast, we have the Gulf Coast, and then we have the Pacific coast. Well, it's easy for a Navy to move from the Atlantic into the Gulf, but it's not easy for the Navy to move from the Atlantic to the Pacific. You have to go all the way around South America. And so he says, a canal through Panama would be ideal to move naval forces from one ocean to the other. And now the reason Panama gets the attention is because it's the thinnest, right? It's the skinniest of the Central American states, so it would be the easiest to dig a canal across. He also advocates for U.S. control of Hawaii, that it would be beneficial for the U.S. to own Hawaii so we could have a naval base there. Right? There are also economic motives for imperialism. The idea behind this is, one, you get access to raw materials. This is the primary reason why a lot of European nations have colonized, right? If you think about Great Britain, we just mentioned that Great Britain was the biggest and greatest, empire in history. Well, Britain is a little tiny island, right? It's a little island up in the North Atlantic. How does it create this, how does it going to compete on the world stage? Um, it needs resources. And so obviously that little island is going to be limited in resources. So going and conquering other places that have resources is sort of key to its survival in the modern world. And we can say the same thing for Japan. Britain and Japan are very similar in terms of what they're having to deal with to compete as a world power. Being a small island requires them to get their resources elsewhere. Now, the U.S. doesn't really have that problem. The U.S., we have a lot of land and we have a lot of resources. So access to raw materials isn't as important to us, but it is convenient, especially when you think about things like fruit. We in America have the luxury to get fruit whenever we want it. We know that fruit is seasonal. So for example, we know like here in Georgia where we live, when it's watermelon season, you can't walk, down the street without somebody trying to, sell you a watermelon. Watermelons are everywhere. It's very obvious when it's watermelon season. However, if you want to, you can get watermelon in the middle of January because in the United States we have access to, things like fruit from other places like South America, right? It's not a matter of survival, but it is a matter of convenience. However, the economic argument for imperialism, at least for the United States, is that we need somebody to buy our stuff. And remember, the United States was the #1 manufacturer in the world. However, you can only manufacture so much stuff. I mean, people can only buy so much. They're not going to keep buying the same stuff over and over again. But those factories are dependent upon people keep buying. The factories have to keep making. Somebody's got to keep buying it. All right, so here we see an example from U.S. Senator Albert Beveridge. So he's arguing for an economic reason for imperialism. He says American factories are making more than the American people can use. American soil is producing more than they can consume. Fate has written our policy for us. The trade of the world must and shall be ours. So he's saying, we're going to have to create other colonies so we can create markets for all of our stuff. Now, something like that economic motive, that can be controversial. The military motive can be controversial. This one here, though, is very controversial, especially today in the climate that we live in today. So we might need to do a little bit more explaining here just to try to wrap our brains around this concept, okay? But we have socio-cultural motivations for imperialism, all right? When we're talking about social typically means, day-to-day life. And typically when we're studying history, social can mean things like race, it can mean things like gender. And then cultural has a lot to do with beliefs, how people think, how they see the world, how they interpret the world, ideas, beliefs, religion, right? So these things can get tied together, all right? So socio-cultural motivations for imperialism are basically based in the belief that Western civilization was superior, right? Now, I understand this is a controversial idea today, right? So I'm not saying that Western civilization is superior to the rest of the world. I'm saying that in the late 18th and early 19th, the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there was a prevalent idea in the West that Western civilization was superior to the rest of the world. All right, so ideas like republicanism and democracy and Christianity and constitutionalism and science and things like that, right? Capitalism. These were considered to be superior. And today, a lot of people still see these things as superior. So I'm not arguing one way or the other. I'm saying that this was a primary factor in the late 19th, early 20th century. So there was a belief in the natural right of conquest and world domination. So we mentioned the idea of manifest destiny earlier. But there was also the desire to spread Christianity, right? That Christianity is the true religion, therefore it must be spread to these parts of the world that don't have it. All right. So there is an English author named Rudyard Kipling. You're probably familiar with this man. He wrote the Jungle Book. So if you're familiar with, either the book or a movie adaptation of the Jungle Book, he's the writer of that, right? So he is English, but he was born in India. So he himself is a product of imperialism. But he wrote a phrase, a poem with the phrase, "the white man's burden." All right. So again, this is controversial today, but this is the idea that white men, right, Western civilization, all right, who just happen to be white, okay, so it's really more about the ideas of what white men had accomplished at this point, was superior, and that they had the responsibility of bringing the rest of the world up, of lifting the world up and bringing people to civilizations. So you see sort of a comic here, a cartoon, and you see a British man, and he's carrying all these peoples on his back. So you see Asians and Africans, and he's carrying them up this hill, and on this hill he's having to cross a whole lot of obstacles, right? So you see things like cannibalism, and you see slavery, right? He has to overcome these obstacles to bring these people to civilization. So this was called white man's burden, right? This is a socio-cultural motivation for imperialism that a lot of people wouldn't agree with today, but at the time it was seen as a good thing, right? This is a good thing that these people in the West are doing, that they're conquering these nations, bringing, civilization to these people. All right, continuing on with the subject of socio-cultural motivations for imperialism, we also have gender anxieties. Now, this sounds kind of weird, but it makes sense. I'll explain it to you, okay? So essentially, gender, what we're talking about is masculinity, all right? Masculinity and femininity, male and female, right? All right, so what has happened is, if we take into account everything we've learned, all right? So in the 1850s and 1860s, there were some pretty major wars, right? So just keeping this in context of American history, 1861 to 1865, we have the American Civil War. This is the biggest, bloodiest war in American history. All of the other wars we have fought do not come close in terms of casualties that the U.S. had during the American Civil War, right? The American Civil War affected everybody. Therefore, there is an entire generation of men who played some role and was impacted by the Civil War. The Civil War is going to be the defining moment of their lives. Whether they're Southerners and they were on the losing side, whether they're Northerners and they were on the winning side, this is the defining moment, right? Which means that there is another generation of men in America. So if you can imagine, 1860s is the Civil War. So by the 1890s, you have a bunch of men in their 20s and 30s whose father fought in the Civil War. So you have a generation of men who grew up listening to their dads whose stories are of the Civil War, right? That is the defining moment of their life. And so this generation of men who grows up after the Civil War is growing up in the shadow of a generation who fought the greatest war in American history, and they're comparing their masculinity to that lens. They're saying, you know, my father was a man because he fought at the Battle of Antietam and he lost his arm, and you know, how do I compare to that? Well, I haven't had anything like that, right? So there's a lot of there's a generation of men who are basically hungry for war to try to prove their masculinity, because again, they're seeing masculinity through this filter of Civil War veterans, right? Then we take into account things we learned about, like the progressive era, the suffragist movement, right? So now women are demanding the right to vote. Women are saying they're equal to men. So you have a generation of men who, for one, can't live up to their father's shadow, right? And then you have women saying, well, I'm the same as you, I'm equal as you, I deserve the same rights as you. And this was threatening to their masculinity. So these guys are really looking for a war to assert their masculinity. All right. And now we have a term here. This term says jingoism. All right. Jingoism. Now that's a funny sounding word. I'll kind of explain that word sort of. So in English, right, some people would say the word gosh, you know, G-O-S-H, gosh. They would say, oh my gosh. Okay. Now it's evident that, you know, there's not really a word gosh. What they're doing is substituting a different word, which in that case would be God, with gosh, because they don't want to use the word God inappropriately, right? So you would say, oh my gosh. Okay, jingo is the same thing, but rather than using the word God, it's the word Jesus or the name Jesus. So rather than using Jesus inappropriately, you would use jingo. Okay, this was in Britain that they did this, right? So they might say the word, instead of by gosh, they might say by jingo. All right, and this became part of a song about going to war with Russia once upon a time. Okay, so the word jingoism has a little bit of an interesting history of itself, but what it comes to mean, what jingoism means, is extreme patriotism in the form of an aggressive or warlike policy. All right, it's basically pride in one's nation to the point that you're willing to fight other nations to prove, you know, your nation's superiority. It's kind of that my dad can beat up your dad thing, but we're talking about nations here. All right. So Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, who during this time, the late 1800s, he is the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Now he is a name we're going to hear a lot in this section. You're going to be taking a lot of notes on Teddy Roosevelt, okay? But right now, we're talking about Teddy Roosevelt, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. That is actually a picture of him there wearing buckskins, holding a rifle. He was a big game hunter. He liked to camp. He liked to explore. He liked to fight. He was a man's man. So he's an example of this gender anxiety. What's interesting about Roosevelt is his father did not serve in the Civil War. Roosevelt comes from a wealthy family, and wealthy people could basically, in the North, wealthy people could buy their way out of service. And so Teddy Roosevelt grew up with a father who didn't serve in the Civil War, and this was a point of shame for him, to the point that he overcompensated for his masculinity by trying to be the toughest man in the room as part of that. So this jingoism sort of applies to him. And he makes a comment here. He says, if by jingoism, so he's obviously using, people using the term jingoism is almost a, it's not complimentary of having this aggressive warlike policy. All right, but he says, if by jingoism they mean a policy in pursuance of which Americans will with resolution and common sense insist upon our rights being respected by foreign powers, then we are jingos, right? So he's basically defending, you know, an aggressive warlike policy in the sake of us being respected as Americans. All right, now all of this to set the stage for what will become America's first sort of imperialist endeavor. Now, America did get involved in, before Japan modernized, America used gunboat diplomacy to force trade with Japan back in the 1850s, and in fact, the U.S. was key in Japan modernizing and sort of becoming the Western nation that we're talking about. But there are those in America who are against imperialism. All right, and so they form what is called the American Anti-Imperialist League. You see there it's established in 1898. So by 1898, all of these other nations that we've talked about, you know, Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, Britain, France, they have already gone out and colonized other parts of the world. America has not. America is now entering the stage to get involved in this age of imperialism. And so the Anti-Imperialist League is there to oppose that. They want to impose U.S. imperialism. All right, why do they want to do that? For one, they believe it violates a fundamental principle of Republican government, right? The United States is a republic, and a republic is based on the idea that authority must derive from the consent of the governed. All right. In other words, the people in charge are in charge because the people who are governed let them be in charge, right? So for example, in America, our president, our Congress, those are elected by us, and we give them consent to make laws for us, right? So in imperialism, if we're ruling another country, then those people don't have consent. So that's, you know, a reason why they oppose imperialism. They believe it goes against the Declaration of Independence, which is the document which states what our values are as a nation. And there's a lot of prominent members of this Anti-Imperialist League, and we're not going to name all of them, but we'll name a few that are interesting. So we have Jane Addams. She was one of the leading suffragists. Andrew Carnegie, who we've talked about. Grover Cleveland, former president. Benjamin Harrison, another former president. Samuel Gompers, he's one of the leaders of the labor movement and the American Federation of Labor. And Mark Twain, the writer, the guy that wrote, you know, Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. So here is a picture, right? And we see, you know, Uncle Sam, which represents the United States, and we see President McKinley there. And he is ordering from a menu, and you see there is basically Cuba, we got Puerto Rico, the Philippines, we got some islands there. Those are, you know, those are there for a reason. So what we're going to see in the next video is America becoming an imperialist nation, joining those other nations as far as creating overseas colonies. So America is going to get its first overseas colonies in this next video that we're going to talk about. So again, this video was really more about setting the stage and giving you the background. All right, so I hope you learned something, I hope you understand, and I hope it'll make more sense in the next video why we did this. All right, thank you.